Welcome to Family Health. In this class session, we will discuss an area of personal health that can have a tremendous impact on the family, and that's stress. We will also view a film that addresses the issue of stress and how it affects our body and how we respond and react to it. Stress, there are acute stressors which are typically unexpected, sudden, and demand tremendous resources within ourselves to deal with them. What is stress? A stressor is any physical or psychological event or condition that produces stress. Stress is the general physiological and emotional state that accompanies the stress response, and the stress response is the physical and emotional changes associated with stress. Our nervous system, which includes the brain, spinal cord, and all our nerves, and the endocrine system is integral in stress, and it is the system of glands, tissues, and cells that secrete hormones into the bloodstream to influence our metabolism and other body processes. Now we're going to view a film called The Biological Mind Seriously Stressed and how our bodies respond to it.
Traffic's awful and you're late for work. The kids are hassling you and the phone won't stop ringing. Your boss is yelling at you and you're behind for your deadline. There's no getting away from stressful situations in modern life. We tend to think of stress as a bad thing, but if you know how stress works, you can use it to your advantage. The pace of life has changed in modern times. 50 years ago, people didn't talk about being stressed out. Whereas these days, it's a hot topic of conversation.
Now, every day, the media puts all of the negative things happening in the world out there in our faces. Our expectations of ourselves in work and what's expected of us and at home have also grown. All of those things compound really to cause a greater vulnerability to stress.
What we may not realise is that stress itself is not the problem.
Stress is a normal part of life. The only time that we have no stress is before we're born and after. Well, actually, not even before we're born. It's conception to death.
Stress itself is not a thing. It's our reaction to things. The stress reaction is not necessarily bad. It can even help us to keep going under pressure. But the effects of continual chronic stress, if we do nothing about it, can be very bad. George Brickell experienced this firsthand in his career filming and editing crime scenes for the police force. After 16 years of close contact with horrific accidents and murders, George's extreme stress levels caused his career to come to an abrupt end.
At one stage I couldn't hold my granddaughter. I think I know why. We had attended a bloke who'd fallen down a light well, and we'd been there 6 weeks and there were maggots all over the place. There were maggots underneath what was left of his skin. And it would sort of ripple with the maggots moving underneath. And when I held my little granddaughter, that's felt as the maggots had looked, if that makes sense.
George's work was intense. No matter how horrific, he was often required to record disaster, accident or crime scenes in grisly detail because what he was filming might be later needed in court. At times his job exposed him to extreme levels of stress. In 1990 he attended the Aramoana massacre when David Gray shot 13 people dead.
And I was absolutely petrified. I was absolutely scared like I've never felt scared before. We were told we were possibly in the range of Gray. If there was any shots, get out and head into the ditch, that we were covered by snipers and they would look for where the bullet came from, sort of thing. When we came back, we went and had a cup of tea and a dry old bread roll. Now, it's an odd thing, but after that, the dry old bread roll, it was the best bread roll I've ever tasted. The tea was probably all boiled to hell, but it tasted just so great. All the senses of smell and sight and vision were very heightened.
The heightening of the senses George experienced in the stressful situation is a standard part of the ancient human response to life-threatening situations, often called the fight, flight, freeze response. In an emergency, humans react as we have done for millions of years. Once we sense the potential threat, our brain triggers a chain of reactions to ensure our survival. First, it activates the sympathetic nervous system. The brain sends an electrical message through the nervous system to the adrenal glands, which flood the body with adrenaline. This initiates the short-term energy burst needed to respond to the emergency. As the message travels through our body, our pupils dilate to increase the information coming in. Our muscles tense up and our breathing becomes fast and shallow to bring more oxygen to our blood. Our heart shifts into high gear so that the blood can move through up to 5 times faster than it would at rest, and with more force. The tiny circular muscles around our arteries tighten up, our blood pressure goes up, and the blood gets delivered more quickly to our exercising muscles.
The important thing about it is that it's a short-term reaction. We either get hit by the bus or we get away. We get away, the danger's gone, and our body returns to a more stable state.
Obviously, this ancient response is still useful when you're about to be hit by a car. But it's not so useful when it's being triggered by stressful situations that aren't life-threatening.
No!
Let's take it from that immediate physical threat to, I have a deadline, I have to get this report written by tomorrow morning or I'm going to lose my job, and I'm feeling totally under pressure and under stress.
The stress response is hardwired into our system, and in today's world it can be triggered by all sorts of things, often more emotional than physical.
There's no physical consequences, but my thinking about it as a stressful situation is essentially telling my body, here is a threat. My body responds to that threat as if it was the physical threat, so activates the fight and flight responses.
Stop making all that noise!
Our bodies flood with adrenaline as they have done for millions of years. But the physical response that we're preparing for is often no longer an option.
The problem in the modern world is that in the face of most of the threats we now face, fighting, running away or freezing are not appropriate responses. If you're in a stressful work situation and you don't like what your boss is saying, can you get up and run out? I don't think so. Can you fight? Can you whack them? I don't think so. And if you sit there and freeze, they'll wonder what the hell's going on. So one of the issues for us now is that we have to find different ways of dealing with stress and of processing it.
You know!
The stress response is a physiological reality. Ignoring it won't stop it from causing damage. But it doesn't have to be damaging. In fact, we can use it to our advantage. Regardless of whether the trigger is emotional or physical, our experience of stress follows a predictable curve. Successful athletes know how to manage that curve, so they can be in the peak performance zone at the right time.
Longo bursting off the back.
In a contact sport like rugby, you can go out there and be overhyped and you miss your first couple of tackles because you're trying to get there too quickly rather than just sort of relax and just go with the flow of it. And the other side, if you're under it in the zone, you miss the game, halfway it's gone before you know it, so you miss it. So it's quite an art actually, and the people that can do it consistently are usually the ones that can perform.
It's managing which zone you're in that's the key to maintaining your performance over time. If you push yourself too hard, you can get into trouble surprisingly quickly.
So typically in sport, a player may lose their cool and strike at another player. They may abuse a referee. They may freeze. They may choke. And we see all these behaviours which are indications where they've moved to a point where they just go. And I think you see that in the workplace, and I think you see that where all of a sudden people talk about the straw that breaks the camel's back, which is probably just another name for moving along that curve to the point where it's too much and they just crash.
One way to avoid that crash is not to stay in the peak performance zone for too long.
We all need rest, recuperation, and to de-stress our systems, if you like. So the importance of that is that in terms of workplace, people need to not have to sustain performance for 8 hours or 10 hours a day, 5 or 6 days a week, because ultimately their performance will fall.
After 20 years hard work as a top player in the corporate world, IBM executive Sandra Pickering woke up one morning after a 2-week holiday and couldn't face going back to work.
And that's when I realised I really was quite stressed out, and I needed to take a longer break away from work to really think through what I wanted to do going forward and how I could actually manage that situation better.
At the age of 39, Sandra had been working intensely on a special project for 7 years, which hadn't left her much time to spend with her family. When the project fell over, she suddenly felt she had to get out or go under.
I was quite ready to pack my career in, which, looking back on it, was a bit of a rash decision, obviously. I think things had got that bad for me that I was ready to do that. And that was fairly significant, because I'd had a good, strong career in the IT industry, been successful. It wasn't like I was failing at any point, but yeah, things had got that bad for me internally that I decided that I was prepared to do that.
Sandra had spent months working long hours, often on the other side of the world in a different time zone.
I'd go back to the hotel room, perhaps have some dinner, then I'd be on my laptop picking up my mail from New Zealand that had arrived sort of the previous night, and then possibly I'd be on phone calls till 2, 3 in the morning. There could be a 16, 18-hour day by the time the time zone kicked in New Zealand where they would start working. Anywhere from 5 to 20 people would be on the conference call, could last anywhere from 30 minutes to 2 hours, and invariably a number of people would get a number of actions out of it. So you could come away with 10 actions after a 2-hour call and 2 o'clock in the morning. And I allowed that to happen by having my phone on, obviously, and by looking at the mail. I should have just switched everything off.
But Sandra didn't switch things off. She kept pushing herself to keep performing for as long as it took to get the job done, without counting the cost to herself.
I was basically exhausted. I was really tired. I had, over about the last 12 months prior to that, had a lot of trouble disconnecting myself from work. I found it hard to relax. And I think that just built up over a period of time. And the most significant thing for me was the lack of, good quality sleep time in that period of time. And then I guess what happens then is that you start to feel sort of anxious. For me, I found it hard to do things outside of work because it came sort of the normal thing for me to be working extremely long hours. So when I had time off, I sort of couldn't relax in the way I'd been used to. It was just a combination of things, but mainly the lack of sleep, I think, resulted in me feeling quite stressed out.
In fact, Sandra was experiencing some of the classic symptoms of chronic stress.
If stress is getting you to the point where you're constantly anxious and worried and agitated, and you can't relax, well then people are caught in a vicious cycle where the things that normally keep them well no longer work. And that's when taking some more active steps and sometimes seeking support of others or more professional help becomes important. If you can no longer relax and recuperate and recover, it is one of the signals that you're on a slippery slope.
Sandra was sliding steadily down that slippery slope from normal, healthy stress to unhealthy stress. It can happen to anyone.
Stress exists on a continuum in terms of our responses to it. So there is normal stress, which is a productive thing. If you didn't feel slightly anxious about exams, you wouldn't study as hard. And the stress focuses your mind and you're more able to absorb information and learn and so on. You can get into a situation of chronic stress where you aren't sleeping so well and so you're tired and so you're therefore not absorbing information and so you have to work harder and you get into a vicious cycle, and that's chronic stress. And at any one time there are a significant number of people in any group suffering from effects of chronic stress, and that might be related to work or relationship difficulties and so on.
And when you are fully caught up in what you're doing, recognizing your own slide along the stress continuum is not always easy.
The thing I'd lost in that period of time was perspective. You know, work had become all-encompassing by the way I had acted, not by anything anyone else had done. So I'd lost perspective. It was like, you know, I felt invincible and that I could manage. I thought that I was in control of the situation. It wasn't a question of not wanting to ask for help. I didn't think I needed it, basically. And I'm sure if I'd asked for it, I would have got it.
Typically, for people in her position, Sandra simply kept going, working long hours, day after day, to get the job done.
The classic thing that happens to those people is that they crash when they're on holiday. And what's happening there is that the signals of stress just aren't getting through in their frantic, busy life. And suddenly they're on holiday and there's all this room in their life, and what they're left with is their distressed state.
And that's exactly what happened to Sandra. It took a 2-week break for the message to get through.
The first week I started to relax. The second week I started to tense up, thinking I was having to go back to work the next week. And that's when I knew that, you know, something was not quite right. Everything had just come to a head, and I was at breaking point then.
By pushing herself so relentlessly, Sandra had moved out of the peak performance zone into what in stress terms is called the resistance phase. She was still performing, but it was costing her more and more, and she was starting to feel the effects of chronic stress.
When stress becomes too much for us, we develop a range of kinds of symptoms, and those symptoms directly relate to the underlying physiology and hormones we've talked about. So people who are constantly perceiving threat in terms of stressful situation, and so who are constantly secreting adrenaline into their system, will have a range of symptoms which result from that.
And it's not just adrenaline causing these symptoms. As these Navy cadets race against time to stop the ship from sinking, other powerful hormones are also released to further increase their chances of survival in the face of such immediate danger. Once the adrenaline's flowing, the brain activates our hormonal messenger system. Through a tiny circuit, a stream of hormones releases into the pituitary gland, which triggers the signal to the adrenal glands to release a whole family of powerful stress hormones, such as cortisol. They change the way our bodies work to support the short-term action of the adrenaline. So the energy patterns in these Navy cadets' immune systems are changing to meet the immediate threat to their survival at the expense of longer-term projects. After all, why use energy to prevent cancer when your life's at stake right now? Several experiments have been done around the world measuring the impact on the immune system of these powerful stress hormones. In America, stress questionnaires were filled out by volunteers who then had a flu virus sprayed up their noses. People who saw themselves as being highly stressed were more likely to get the flu, showing their immune systems had been affected by their perceived stress. In New Zealand, they continued the research, using people having surgery. A week before their hernia operations, people again filled out questionnaires on how stressful they saw their lives as being. Then, for the first 24 hours after the operation, liquid was collected from the wound site for examination.
The more stress the people were feeling before the surgery, the lower the concentration of immune hormones draining into the wound site over the next 24 hours. Showing that not only susceptibility to infection, but other parts of the immune system involved in wound healing are affected by stress perceptions as well.
And the immune system is not the only system that can be affected. Too many stress hormones circulating can affect us in many different ways. From an evolutionary point of view, we are not designed to have these strong hormones constantly released into our bodies. But how much they affect us and which part of us they affect depends on where we are on the stress continuum at the time, as well as on our individual health weaknesses. For some, the weak link in their health chain may be cardiovascular with an increased risk of heart disease. For others, it's gastrointestinal and more chance of a stomach ulcer. And for others, their vulnerability may be psycho-emotional, which may lead to chronic stress or depression.
The key to it really is firstly recognising when we're moving into an unhealthy stress situation, and secondly, having the means to deal with it.
Dealing with it can sometimes mean getting help from a professional. After the Aramoana massacre, police videographer George Brickell, like everyone else involved, was directed to see a psychologist.
After the sessions, I was very tearful. I cried an awful lot. But the second and third, I felt an awful lot better. This was the first time that I'd been to a psychologist, and it was a revelation, I guess you could say. In as much that the best way I can describe it is, he peeled me back like a banana. Jobs like Foxpine that I've been to, and things that are, with bits of children and all sorts of other things that had happened. He suddenly uncovered those, and suddenly I had to deal with them and talk about them. And that was, in one way, it was an extremely unpleasant thing, but after a little while of doing that, I felt just so much better.
Despite this sort of professional help, after some years, George's occasional brush with chronic stress had reached the point where he was diagnosed with PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder.
I had a rather good analogy from one shrink. He said, if you could imagine a cupboard that you open and you put clothes or linen or whatever into it, you can keep putting it in so long and keep closing the door until it gets to the point where you've got to push the door closed. And then you get to the point where you really, really cram it in and you push the door down and you let it go and you think it's all okay and it's all there, but it springs open. And that is very much how PTSD creeps up on you.
I mean, to take that analogy further in terms of the reality of stress in our lives and the need to deal with it, the person who gets to the point that the cupboard bursts open is clearly someone who isn't able to see the signals about the cupboard getting fuller. Whereas people who aren't so vulnerable to the effects of stress are often those who are able to see the cupboards getting full and do a spring clean.
Sandra was totally unaware that her stress levels were becoming harmful. By the time she did work out something was wrong, it took her a full 10 weeks to recover.
Because I didn't know, it's not that I felt sick, it just became a normal way for me to operate. Tense, get agitated quite quickly and lose my temper over small things. Probably wasn't that pleasant to be around. My own personal well-being wasn't what it should have been. It took something reasonably dramatic to happen, and then for me to take a break from and look in hindsight, for me to discover, yes, there was something wrong with the way I was working.
Like Sandra and George, many people won't recognise their stress levels are out of control until something dramatic happens. But symptoms such as not getting to sleep easily, headaches, upset tummy, sweaty hands or shortness of breath can all be signals of our slide down the stress continuum, if only we could recognise them. Other symptoms such as nervousness, short-term memory loss, not being able to concentrate, overreacting, and grumpiness can also be your body telling you it's stressed.
Some people just don't get the messages their body is giving them about tense muscles or knotted stomach or the range of other kinds of physical symptoms that arise in the face of stress. So those symptoms have to get worse and worse and worse before they'll respond to them.
It took a long time for Sandra to recognise her stress symptoms, and her husband Phil wasn't aware there was a problem either.
Sandra was keeping the stress to herself, and I might say did a very good job of doing so. It wasn't obvious to me that she was under so much stress. So yeah, I was somewhat surprised when Sandra said she couldn't face going back to work. In fact, I was staggered. I thought, well, come on, you've got to go back to work, you've got to support me, support Jordan and I, the lifestyle that we've become used to over the last 5 years. But quite a shock, really.
It caused a bit of tension between us, actually, because I couldn't understand why you wouldn't understand.
Well, that's right, it did actually, yeah. Now that you remind me, yes, it did, because I was sort of saying to Sam, well, come on, get up, don't be a silly girl, get up, get off to work, and she was saying, well, no. And it wasn't until she went to the doctor and got a medical certificate that I accepted the fact that, well, yeah, there's a problem here.
Once she worked out how stressed she was, Sandra took immediate steps to bring herself back along the stress continuum.
She identified it a wee way down the track, but still was able to weather this time and get back to functioning. The reasons for that are likely to be two things. Firstly, that at some level she has greater resilience personally. But secondly, the way she was thinking about and the rules she had around herself were likely to be different. People who are able to identify stress and deal with it in general are people who are able to recognise when they're having difficulties, whereas people who continue on down the path of stress do so because they're often people who have a very low opinion of their performance and so tend to overperform as a compensation for that, who tend to be very perfectionistic, for example, so they have such high standards for themselves that they can never meet them, are very driven then to continue to perform, aren't able to accept that they might not be coping and so on. So they will go far, far further down a stress continuum before something happens to make them deal with it. And that something, in the worst case, may be progressing to severe depression and a total breakdown.
Bronwyn Thompson was a long way down the stress continuum before she realised something was wrong.
I probably was depressed for a long time before I even allowed myself to have the label, but it really came to my attention when my son was about 8 months old, and I just was trying to study for an exam and have this child that wouldn't sleep, and I was losing weight and I couldn't sleep even though he was starting to sleep, and I felt awful. So I went to the GP and said, I feel awful, and she said, well, you're depressed. I was horrified. I thought, this can't be me. I'm still studying, I'm keeping it together. I just feel awful.
In those days, Bronwyn had a set of cast iron rules that she imposed upon herself and the way she lived.
Things like I must be on time, or I must always please people, or I must always do 100%. Those sorts of things. They drive the way that we are in the world, and that starts to drive this internal belief that no matter what situation I'm in, no matter what else is happening, I must be perfect, I must work really hard. And so for me that had become an ironclad rule that I must never disappoint people, mustn't let them down, I've got to always be perfect, I've got to really work hard, and that ruled everything.
We all have our internal beliefs, and they can play a big part in how we react to stressful situations and the effect they will have on us.
Each of us has a given level of personal vulnerability to the effects of stress, and that's determined by two factors. The first is our more psychological makeup, so the kinds of rules we have for ourselves, whether we tend to take difficulties in life very personally, those kinds of things. The second part of it is biological factors, so things like if we have a family history of depression or anxiety and so on, then we will tend possibly to have a lower threshold to developing those symptoms ourselves.
In the same way that we are all different both physically and mentally, we are also different in terms of our vulnerability to stressful situations, as well as what we find stressful in the first place. So what may be a big problem for one person is not necessarily for another. Our individual capacity to deal with stress is tested when we come up against stressful events in our lives. Many of the most stressful things in life, such as the death of a close family member, are unavoidable. For some people, marriage is just as stressful as divorce, because different people will be affected differently, depending on how they perceive events in their lives.
Stress is an imbalance, really, between what you've got in terms of your personal resources and what demands are being placed on you. And it's I like the Mental Health Foundation definition that anxiety or stress is when you overestimate the threat, you think it's more than you can handle, and you underestimate your ability to manage that. And that's when you start to become stressed or distressed.
That's why these Navy cadets are being trained not to overestimate the threat, and to know that they can manage the threat that's there even under extreme pressure. And of course, all the activity is using the stress hormones in the way they were intended. Because physical activity is still one of the things we can all do to help stop our stress levels getting on top of us.
At some level, when we're under stress, it does affect us physically, and so regular exercise is a good way of burning off that energy, if you like, of actually de-stressing ourselves. And I mean, there's good evidence to show that exercise has a positive effect in terms of dealing with stress symptoms.
Exercising may help because the stress hormones released during the primitive fight, flight, freeze response prepare our bodies for a physical reaction. For many of us, exercise is the closest modern equivalent we have to running away from a saber-toothed tiger. Which is all very well if you happen to have worked out that you are stressed in the first place.
It's very important for people to be able to recognise stress early, but also recognise that for some people that's just not in their makeup. And so it's important for people to have access to systems in the workplace and in their life that can recognise the signs of stress and help those people identify what it is that's causing them problems and to be able to address it.
Which is where Bronwyn comes in. Part of her job now is to identify stressed people in her health and safety assessments. Because of her own experience with stress and depression, she can recognise other people's unhealthy stress levels even if they haven't worked it out for themselves. People like her play an important part in stress management for large organisations such as hospitals.
So when we were looking in your last job, what do you think your stress levels were?
Unfortunately, the way we worked, it went from 0 to 10 in about 2 minutes.
Angela was highly stressed and so sore after a day's work she couldn't hang out the washing.
My fingers were feeling a bit numb and my wrist was really sore, and my elbows and shoulders were aching from the constant typing that I was doing.
Angela had to change the way she thought about work as well as the way she worked.
Instead of just typing solidly for 2 hours, I can, type for 20 minutes and take a quick break and get back to it, and I can sustain that for maybe 3 or 4 hours as long as I take those breaks.
Angela had to find ways to remind herself to take the breaks she needed.
It was a bit tough at first because it's the habits I found. I'm just so used to doing one thing, so it was really retraining myself. I actually had post-it notes up telling me to relax and things like that and take a break.
In fact, Angela was learning not to ignore the stress signals she was getting.
Listening to what my body's saying. If I'm in pain, there's a reason, and to stop ignoring it and to take care of myself.
Bronwyn also encouraged Angela to change the rules she was living by.
Psychologically, I'd be reminding myself that it's a good thing that I'm taking a rest. It's not bad of me to be stopping for a couple of minutes.
So you're not being lazy.
Yeah. I'm not being lazy. I'm taking care of myself, and now I can just go home and relax. And if I want to hang up the washing or something like that, I can actually raise my arms up and I can do things like that now.
Unlike Angela, police videographer George Brickle did recognise when his stress levels were getting out of hand. He knew when he needed time off to recover from the stress of his job, and because of the sort of hours he sometimes worked, it often happened naturally.
On one occasion with Cursor Jensen, for instance, we worked for 34 hours without a break, without sleep. Many other times 24 hours, 26 hours. And the normal working day was about 10 hours.
Because of the build-up of time off in lieu, George sometimes had to take a month off to catch up.
I found that was very good because if I felt really bad, I could, or I knew I was starting to feel bad, I could go and take that month off and I could come back refreshed and, with the matter sorted in my head.
What George is talking about is recovery time. It's a crucial part of the stress response curve. It's the downtime we all need to be able to keep performing, whether it's life at the office or an international rugby career.
It doesn't matter how strong you are mentally or physically, you've got to have downtime because otherwise the build-up of all the tension and the anxieties that come with it won't allow you to perform. It's impossible.
Go back. Win it for New Zealand in the last seconds. And it is is going to be a triumph for Razor Robertson.
If you don't get recovery, it's basically you lose your consistency, I think, and you won't be able to peak either because your focus, from week to week, no one can sustain that intensity all the time. And if in rugby, especially, if you have the ability to switch off, you're much better preparation for the next week.
In fact, not enough recovery time can have serious consequences.
When an athlete's in the too high zone too long, it has a cost on their health, and they obviously will experience different stress symptoms, and the longer that continues, then the degree of intensity of those particular symptoms will increase. And if it continues too long for an athlete, they can quite often experience burnout. The athletes tend to crash and they lose all motivation to actually train, to be involved, and they normally need periods away from the actual environment to freshen and rekindle the fire within them.
So everyone needs recovery time, but sometimes, especially if our lives are particularly stressful, normal recovery time just won't be enough. The tipping point for George Brickell was when he had to compile a training tape for police cadets.
And the next thing I had was a program to make on death, which involved going and gathering every type of conceivable type of death that one could imagine. Be it hangings, be it drownings, be it shotgun, be it beatings, be air crashes, whatever. And you got continual exposure to that. And then to go back, put it all together, look at the material, and then start editing it. It was continual exposure after that.
After 16 years filming horrific crime, accident and disaster scenes, police videographer George Brickell's stress levels were getting out of control.
I was going back at night and editing at night, simply so that people couldn't see me crying. I would burst into tears with certain things, certain topics, certain smells, sounds. Going into work in the morning, my feet felt heavy, almost as if you were walking through porridge. So I knew I was in trouble, but this had happened in the past as well, and I'd got some competent help and was able to get through it.
George was experiencing other physical symptoms of stress as well.
Things like when you went to work in the morning, inevitably you'd have diarrhoea. The first stop was the toilet. In the past, apart from that, it had loss of balance, pain, chest pains, and various things which will prove quite embarrassing once you went to the doctor and presented with the symptoms and couldn't find anything for it. It became very embarrassing.
George knew he needed the sort of treatment that had helped him in the past, and he asked for it for himself and his staff. He believes that it was when his request was not adequately met that he went beyond the point of no return. Until then, it wasn't too late.
No, about 10 or 15 homicides later it was irretrievable, because in that time we had had other help inflicted upon us. And by that I mean that the boss had instructed that we must have one particular person, and that person it didn't work, and we told the boss so. My staff were complaining to me. We made an issue of it, and we were told that we had to confront the person ourselves. I still feel very angry about that.
George felt strongly enough about the way that he had been treated to take his employers to court. The mental harm George Brickell suffered and the way it was handled cost the police force $242,000.
I think the judge summed it up very nicely in his summary, that if the tapes that I was dealing with had been in a box that fell off a shelf and hit me on the head, I'd be covered. Those same tapes, because they affected us in a different way, psychologically, then I wasn't covered.
Increasingly around the world, stress is being recognised as a workplace hazard, and employers are being legally required to provide adequate support where stress levels have become harmful.
One of the problems with this is that certainly in the work that we've done with companies, it's most often the managers who are the most stressed people in the workforce
Sandra Pickering now realises how much her stress levels were impacting on her staff.
When you get to a point yourself that you're stressed or under pressure, you sort of act like that, and I guess you tend to act like that with other people around you. I've always been a person that's felt that it's good to lead by example when I'm managing other people. So I guess on reflection, if I was being totally honest, I was expecting them to do similar things because I was doing it, and why couldn't they do it? So I think that was a really bad thing for me to be doing.
Sandra's lack of awareness is quite typical of people in her position.
They're the people who are having to actually grapple with the effects of this legislation, and yet they're the people who are also suffering the most from the effects of stress, and who are the most high-performing, driven people. Until they can recognise it and deal with it themselves, how the hell are they going to be able to recognise the impact on it for their workforce and their bottom line?
Now, having suffered from the effects of stress herself, Sandra's expectations have changed.
The teams I work with now, I tend to be very mindful of them, ensuring that they do sensible things and work sensible hours. So I think, from that perspective, I'm probably a better person to work with or around. I'm just much more mindful of that stress factor in other people now.
It took 5 years and many job applications before George secured his current position as a handyman, where he has found relative peace.
Just over a year that I've been working for this retirement village, there's only been one instance where I've had anything that's affected us, and that was during a CPR training course. So they brought on a dummy of a baby to be able to demonstrate how to do CPR with a child, with a baby. And it was just a sudden bringing on of this thing when I didn't expect it. That made me take a bolt to the toilet and be sick. Be in a chemical straitjacket, I guess, for the rest of my life to cope with the nightmares, be it ever so small. I suppose I'll get triggered occasionally by things on television. The experts tell us that it'll become, probably the symptoms will become worse in later life. Well, fine. It's just something you've got to accept.
Before she hit the wall with stress, Sandra believed that long hours were essential to any successful career.
I think that's part of the reason why I worked the way I did. I sort of equated success with, the longer you work, the more successful you're going to be. And I thought that for a long time. Looking back on it and looking at what I do now, that's not so. At that stage in my career, I was probably working, anything to 60 to 80 hours a week, if I add up all the time on calls and things.
Whereas these days, Sandra manages her time so that she works closer to 40 hours in a normal week without any loss of efficiency.
Other people, I guess, that work around me could perceive that as, being slack. But I know from my own experience that the results I produce are far better than what I used to. In fact, the company measures us on results, not on the number of hours that we work. So if you're producing the results, you can be working whatever hours it takes to produce those results. And in my case, I can control that to the point where I can produce the same results in half the time.
Nevertheless, Sandra finds she has to watch out that she doesn't slip back into her old ways.
It's like, it's an addiction thing, isn't it? You have to keep going back over and ensuring that, you stick to the things that you want to control. I have at times, felt myself slipping back into the old routine, but yeah, I've been really careful to ensure that I've put things in place to stop that happening. There are times, obviously, in just about everyone's jobs that they have that we have to meet deadlines, and at that time, that bit of stress can actually be quite productive. It can get the adrenaline pumping, and it sort of gets you focused on the task at hand. So if I do that, then I compensate in other ways. Like I might finish early one afternoon and go and pick my son up from school and not feel bad about that or guilty about that.
Sandra believes she's better off for having had her close encounter with chronic stress.
I think I was weaker before because I didn't call it out, as opposed to now where I don't feel guilty or under pressure to say I'll do things that I know aren't reasonable now. So I think I'm actually a stronger person now, because I'm able to juggle, or I try at least to juggle those those balances between work and life a lot better.
Okay, so now we see study guide from documents and content that we have on this film, The Biological Mind Seriously Stressed. You can get a printout of that and follow along, and I will go over the answers to this in the next slide here. And as we see a study guide of the film, stress is not the problem, it is our response to stress that is the problem. Continuous and prolonged stress can be harmful. Heightening of the senses is a common response to stress. In the fight, flight, and freeze response, the sympathetic nervous system is activated, and physiological responses include tightening of the muscles, fast and shallow breathing, pupils dilating to increase information input, heart rate increases, and blood pressure increases, and blood flow increases to the needed musculature. The stress response can be more cumulative, meaning over time, and emotional. The body responds as if it has a physical threat. Fight, flight, or freeze is not an appropriate response. What do? If you stay in this state too long, you will crash. True or false? Stress can be healthy. Yes, that's true. You want to have some level of stress. To be a good student, you need to have the stress to study and not procrastinate. To do a good job, to have and be mindful of deadlines and things that push you to get your work done well and efficiently. Higher our stress, the blank our immune system hormones that get produced, which would be the lower our immune hormones that get produced. So the higher our stress, the lower our immune system hormones that get produced. Stress hormones can be combated by, what was one of the main things they talked about in the film? Exercise. Here we go, kinesiology majors. You should all know this. So blank is the downtime we need to recuperate after stress. Its recovery is the downtime we need to recuperate after stress. Stress can have a trickle-down effect from managers to staff. I've seen that in the workplace, and it can be very unproductive. True or false? The longer you work, the more productive you are. So we saw that in the last case study of the film, and we saw that was false. So actions of the nervous system, which is the parasympathetic nervous system, is a division of the autonomic nervous system that moderates excitatory effects of the sympathetic division, slowing down metabolism and restoring energy supplies. Norepinephrine is a neurotransmitter released by the sympathetic nervous system onto specific tissues to increase their function in the face of increased activity. And when released by the brain, it causes arousal, such as increased attention, awareness, and alertness. It is sometimes referred to as noradrenaline. The sympathetic nervous system is a division of the autonomic nervous system that reacts to danger or other challenges by almost instantly and instinctively accelerating the body processes. So here we see a diagram of the endocrine system, and its job is to regulate glands, tissues, and cells that help control bodily functions. They produce hormones, and they respond to stressors on the body. The nervous system and endocrine systems do work together. The hypothalamus is an almond-sized portion of the brain that controls body temperature, hunger, and important aspects of parenting and attachment behaviors such as thirst, fatigue, sleep, and our circadian rhythms. Acetylcholine, or ACH, is a neurotransmitter that functions in the parasympathetic nervous system to put our body in a state of conducive rest and regeneration, digestion, and reproduction. And the phase is often invoked and described as rest and digest or feed and breed. The pituitary gland is an endocrine gland in the brain that is at the base of the hypothalamus to help regulate growth, blood pressure, energy management, and all functions of the sex organs, thyroid glands, and metabolism, as well as some aspects of pregnancy, childbirth, breastfeeding, water and salt concentration at the kidneys, and temperature regulation and pain relief. ACTH is a hormone secreted by the anterior pituitary gland that regulates the amount of cortisol in our bodies. The adrenal glands can produce cortisol, which is a naturally occurring steroid hormone that is produced in response to stress and blood sugar levels. Epinephrine, or adrenaline, is a hormone produced in the adrenal gland that plays an important role in the fight or flight response by increasing blood flow to the muscles and output of the heart and pupil dilation response, as well as our blood sugar levels. Endorphins are a natural pain reliever, and the hormones naturally produced by the body that decrease the communication of pain signals and also produce a feeling of pleasure and euphoria, not unlike those of opioid or narcotic medication. Homeostasis is the state of steady internal physical and chemical conditions that the body maintains to stay in equilibrium. So here we have a diagram of the physiological reactions to stress. Cortisol being produced as steroid hormone secreted by the outer layer of the cortex of the adrenal gland. And our fight or flight reaction is a defense reaction in the sympathetic nervous system that prepares an individual for conflict or escape by triggering hormonal, cardiovascular, metabolic, and other changes. We can't continue to be in this state or it will cause us to crash. This is an example of how the body responds during the fight or flight reaction. In response to a stressor, the autonomic nervous system and the endocrine system prepare the body to deal with an emergency in the following ways. So stress, our body can have various emotional and behavioral responses to stress. Effective responses to stress include talking, laughter, exercise, and time management. Ineffective responses to stress can be really any kind of addictive behavior or destructive behavior, including overeating, procrastination, and frustration at the perhaps maybe more personal and less harmful level, but can also lead to other addiction processes as well. In terms of personality and stress, our personality is the sum of behaviors and cognitive and emotional tendencies that we have. We've heard of a type A personality, which tends to be ultra-competitive, controlling, impatient, aggressive, and sometimes even hostile. They have a higher perceived stress level and more problems with coping with stress. People with type A personalities tend to explode during stressful moments and are upset by occurrences that otherwise people might merely consider as annoyances. Studies have shown that certain characteristics of type A personalities like anger, cynicism, and hostility increase the risk of heart disease over time. Type B personality, this personality is relaxed and contemplative, and they tend to be less frustrated by daily events and tolerant of the behavior of others. Type C personality is characterized by anger suppression and difficulty expressing emotions and feelings of hopelessness and despair, and an exaggerated response to minor stressors. The term hardiness or resilient personality is the ability to deal with stress with a level and type of optimism. They view the potential stressors as opportunities for growth and learning and not as burdens. And social and academic success and has to do with resilience. Again, there tends to be three types of resilience. There's a non-reactive resilience where the person does not react to a stressor, a homeostatic resilience where a person reacts strongly to a stressor but returns to baseline functioning rather quickly, and a positive growth resilience where a person learns to grow and learn from the stressful situation. General adaptation syndrome, it's a pattern of stress responses consisting of three stages: the alarm stage, the resistance stage, and the exhaustion stage. It describes what many believe is a universal and predictable response to all stressors. Some stressors are actually pleasurable things that shouldn't involve pressure, like going to a party, but others are unpleasant, like a bad grade or unexpected bill or illness. The stress triggered by a pleasant stressor is called eustress, and the stress resulting from an unpleasant stressor is called distress. The alarm or panic stage includes a series of complex events brought on by the fight or flight reaction. At this stage, the body is more susceptible to disease or injury because it is geared up to deal with a crisis. A person might experience headaches, indigestion, anxiety, or an interruption in sleeping patterns or eating changes. Resistance has to do with the continued stress the body develops with a new level of homeostasis, in which it is more resistant to disease and injury than usual. In the resistance stage, the person can cope with normal life and added stress. Exhaustion or fatigue, the first two stages of general adaptation syndrome, can require a great deal of energy. If a stressor persists or several stressors occur in succession, general exhaustion can set in. However, this is not the exhaustion one has after a long, busy day, but it's rather a life-threatening physiological state that people often end up hospitalized for. The long-term wear and tear of the stress response is called an allostatic load. This can depend on a lot of factors within the individual, such as genetics, life experiences, and your emotional and behavioral responses to stressors. This can also cause an imbalance of responses to various bodily systems, such as heart disease, hypertension, obesity, and reduced brain and immune system functions. Basically, when your allostatic load exceeds your ability to cope, you're most likely to get sick. So during the alarm or panic stage of the general adaptation syndrome, a lower resistance to the injury is evident. With prolonged exposure to repeated stressors, exhaustion sets in, and with the return of low resistance levels seen during the acute levels of stress. This is why during a situation such as what we're in with COVID-19, it's important that you stay healthy habits, good eating habits, good rest, and keep your resistance levels high. The underlying premise of psychoneuroimmunology is that stress, through the actions of the nervous system and endocrine system, impairs the immune system and thereby affects your health. Not all stress is harmful, and even large stress-induced immune changes can have small clinical or medical consequences because they are short-term or because the immune system has a redundant component that compensates for these changes. The immune system is indeed complex and remarkably flexible. That being said, our mood, personality, behavior, and immune functions are very intertwined. Generally, pessimistic people may disengage socially and neglect their basics of healthcare or become very passive. Being able to approach a stressor with optimism, successful coping, and a positive problem-solving lifestyle may actually positively influence your immunity. Here's a table of some of the physical, emotional, and behavioral symptoms of stress. We see physical effects such as dry mouth, excessive perspiration, frequent illness, grinding of the teeth, TMJ problems that I see in physical therapy, headaches, blood pressure, pounding heart, stiff neck, and of course next to, say, ulcers, stiff neck and back pain are very common with excessive stress in your life. Emotional symptoms like anxiety and depression, fatigue, being impulsive. This is where you run into problems making bad financial decisions can occur during stress. Trouble remembering our old methods of maybe multitasking, which we're typically not very good at multitasking. We tend to just go from one topic to another without really doing either of them very well. Behavioral symptoms, crying, disrupted eating habits, harsh treatment of others can also lead to sexual problems and social isolation, and just making bad decisions, again with purchases, financially, saying things that you wish you hadn't said. There are links between stress and specific conditions such as cardiovascular disease, hypertension and high blood pressure, stroke, which is an interruption in blood flow to the brain, cardiomyopathy, which is heart muscle disease. Stress can also weaken your immune system and ability to fight illness such as colds and opportunistic diseases and infections, and can even be linked to things like cancer. Some of the psychological problems that caused by stress can lead to depression, panic attacks, anxiety, eating disorders, and PTSD, which is post-traumatic stress disorder, which a lot of soldiers coming back from battle encounter. Again, other health problems include digestive problems, headaches and migraines, insomnia, injuries of all different types, pregnancy and complications, type 2 diabetes, premature aging. And in terms of injuries and illness, they can also affect the workplace significantly, as people will call in sick eventually more frequently, not because they may be actually sick, but they just might be sick of going to work because of the stress that they're going through. So common sources of stress. All of these things can lead to what is now an actual clinical term called burnout, which is a state of physical, mental, and emotional exhaustion. But all of these things can be common sources of stress, the struggles that we go through. And as college students, you're going through a lot of it as well. So there are some good techniques for managing stress. You can control the stress in your life by taking the following steps to build up your support system and improve your communication skills, develop healthy exercise, eating, and sleeping habits, and learn to identify and moderate your individual stressors in life. There are some good cognitive techniques to consider. Think and act constructively by sorting out the worries that you have and determining which things are needless, such as what people are thinking about me, or things that you can't control. Consider the things that you can control and take positive steps to carry them out. Take control with the items that you do have some influence and power to control, and problem solve by sitting down with a pen and paper and do the following. Find the problem in 1 or 2 sentences. Identify the causes of the problem that you're having. Consider alternative solutions and don't just stop with the most obvious one. Weigh the positive and negative consequences for each alternative. Make a decision and choose a solution. Make a list of what you will need to do and act on your decision. Begin to carry out your list, and if you're unable to do that, temporarily turn to other productive items and evaluate the outcomes and revise your approach if necessary. Modify your expectations. Cultivate your sense of humor. Laughter is the best medicine. Laugh and the world laughs with you, and you cry alone is a common saying. See, even dry, cynical humor works too. So focus on what's important by weeding out the trivia and living in the present, and go with the flow, because not everything is just the hill you're going to have to die on or even requires a response at all. So some typical relaxation techniques. Relaxation response is a physiological state characterized by a feeling of warmth and quiet mental alertness. Yes, it can be quite spiritually calming as well. Progressive relaxation is a simple technique that can be used at all ages, and I used it with my kids at bedtime as well. It involves tensing and relaxing your muscles in various body and muscle groups from head to toe. Visualization is a technique to promote relaxation or improve performance that involves creating or recreating a vivid mental picture of a place or experience that is also known as imagery. Meditation is a technique for quieting the mind by focusing on a particular word, object, such as a candle or flame, or a process such as breathing. And biofeedback is a technique in which monitoring devices help a person to become conscious of the body processes such as body temperature or blood pressure in order to consciously exert some control over them. Some very counterproductive coping strategies: turning to tobacco, alcohol, drugs, unhealthy eating habits, even illicit drug use, as we see listed up there, including addiction. One of the more common tools used in the addictive process is called the FASTER scale during recovery, which is a time where you're at peace, you're at ease, you're not fighting yourself, you're not having any inner conflicts or secrets, and you're resolving your problems, you're identifying your fears and feelings. Those are a good time to be in. You're keeping commitments to meetings, friends, people, and self, and being open, honest, making eye contact with others, and reaching out to others, and increasing in your relationships and your accountability. Someone who's been struggling bad, unhealthy habits, they want to be in that state of recovery. It's important for them to know when they're in a dangerous spot, and during their weekly meetings, a lot of groups go over what it's called a FASTER scale. FASTER is an acronym for forgetting priorities, anxious, sped up, ticked off, exhausted, or relapse, and you just take inventory of where you are that week. Forgetting priorities is you're starting to believe the present circumstances and moving away from healthy influences in your life. Anxiety is a growing background noise of undefined fear and getting energy from emotions. Speeding up is trying to outrun the anxiety, which is usually the first sign of depression. Being ticked off is getting an adrenaline high on your anger and aggression. You're having road rage situations. You're snapping at people. Being exhausted is a loss of physical and emotional energy coming off the adrenaline high and the onset of depression. And relapse is unfortunately where you return to the place you swore you'd never go again. You begin coping with life on your own terms and self-medicating on unhealthy things. So those are, again, using the FASTER scale is a good way to be mindful of where you are in your mental and emotional state from week to week. So again, creating a personal plan for managing stress. Here are some good tools. A stress journal is where you log the date, time, stressor, and your response or coping strategy, which can help you develop a habit of responding versus reacting in a healthier and more well thought out way. This may be one area where electronic communication can backfire and a well-considered response is lacked. So right now you can practice deep breathing for 5 to 10 minutes, visualize relaxing a peaceful place and experience it as vividly as possible. Do some stretching exercises. Get out your date book and schedule your week and include your downtime as well. Make those non-negotiable, such as walking and relaxing, and don't let them get squeezed out by other things. And in the future, develop intentional time by taking a class or workshop that can help you overcome a source of stress. It may need to be intentional and at first inconvenient, but then it develops into a healthy pattern that you feel that a void has been filled in your life and you feel out of sync when you miss it. So those are all really important things to help, and maybe even getting outside help through a third-party counselor or a professional counselor or psychologist can be very helpful as well. So in closing, just a reminder to check your university email daily for any important announcements. Log on to the course Blackboard page daily throughout the semester for any assignment guidelines, calendaring, and checking your updated grades. And read the assigned text readings listed in your syllabus from our online text. Thanks everybody, and hope you stay healthy. Be sure to give me an email communication if you have any questions or concern about the course. Thank you.